So a very warm welcome to you all. My name is Mark Lanesmith. I am chaplain at the University of Reading in the UK, and I'm one of the hosts of Café Théologique. Café Théologique is based in Reading in the UK and is a joint initiative between the University of Reading's Chaplaincy and the Anglican Diocese of Oxford. It's our aim to bring theological ideas into the public realm for discussion. And tonight for us marks a new departure as we put our toe in the water with a new style for Café Théologique, which we've called Homebrewed. And in Homebrewed, we'd offer bite-sized theology, rather in the tradition of poetry slams, in which we'd like to invite local people to share their theological ideas. This is a new venture for us, and if you'd like to make a pitch for a topic you're interested in, I'd really encourage you to email me. I'll share on our screen now some details about how you can get in contact with us. We're going to have two presentations this evening, each about 15 to 20 minutes long, followed by a period of discussion. The first of our presenters is the Revd Dr Phillip Hobday, vicar of St Peter's Church, Earley, which is on the outskirts of Reading. He's a former chaplain of Magdalen College, Cambridge, and Philip recently completed his doctorate on the 16th century Anglican theologian Richard Hooker. And tonight he's presenting on the question, whose Church of England is it anyway? Richard Hooker and the identity or identities of Anglicanism. So really warm welcome, Philip. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Mark and Susie, and thank you very much for asking me. It's lovely to be here. The downside of not being able to see you is that, of course, I can't see any audience reactions. So I will just assume that you are agreeing with everything I say and laughing politely at all of my slightly naff jokes. I'm just going to share my screen. Sharing my screen is like you're on mute, isn't it? It's one of the sort of catchphrases of the modern world that we live in. We'll come on to Richard Hooker in a minute, but we're starting somewhere else. Depending on which survey you look at, somewhere approaching half the population of England, somewhere between a third and a half, say that they are Christians and that they belong to the Church of England. Now, this is almost certainly an inflated figure on any measure, given that that leads you to believe that somewhere between 20 and 30 million people are C of E, when on a good day there might be just over 1 million in church on a Sunday. So what do we mean by the Church of England that we claim in some sense, many of us, to be a part of? And if there are all sorts of different ideas about what it might mean to be in the Church of England, whose Church of England is it anyway? What is the Church of England and to whom does it belong? Some years ago, for reasons I now can't remember, I was asked to look after a bishop who was visiting my college. I was a young and very green student, and I didn't really know what you did with a bishop. So I asked an old and wise priest how to tell what you should do with an episcopal visitor. He said that in his experience, there were 3 kinds of bishop. So from left to right, there are cup of tea bishops. These are the kind of pompous codgers who take their role and themselves very seriously and should only be given a cup of tea. If you were a bit less sure, you thought they might be traditional but a little bit lighter, you should say glass of sherry bishop, something dry and safe. And if the bishop you encountered looked like someone who might not take themselves too seriously and might even have a bit of a laugh with you and about themselves, you should offer them a gin and tonic bishop. I tried this technique on my episcopal visitor and it worked a treat. He was definitely a gin and tonic bishop. In fact, he had 2 gins and tonics in the space of half an hour and then said he was terribly sorry he had to go, but he was off to meet a friend in a cocktail bar. So bishops come in different flavours. Some are gins and tonics, some are sherries, some are cups of tea. And the fact that there are such very different characters we see among our bishops is an indication that there's not just one kind of bishop, because there's not really just one kind of Anglican. Think of this in another way. Imagine a student arriving at Reading for the first time in the autumn. at least not in the autumn of 2020 when they could go nowhere, but perhaps in the autumn of 2021. And they know vaguely that they're C of E and they want to go to an Anglican church on a Sunday morning. And I'm slightly abashed to see that some of the churches I'm about to mention have representatives here this evening. It's no particular sign of favour or opprobrium, it's just attempting to reflect the spread. So they might find themselves at St Giles, a church in what we might call the Anglo-Catholic tradition, with lots of colour and drama, with clergy at the front wearing fine vestments in different colours, with incense and statues, icons, stained glass, and singing about Jesus and Mary in perhaps traditional language hymns. They could wander just across town to another building, Greyfriars. Here you couldn't tell who the clergy were because they would be dressed in the same chinos and t-shirts as the rest of their congregation. There would be a worship band at the front, not an altar, whereas in the first church you'd probably be sharing bread and wine every week. In this church, bread and wine would be a rarer event, something shared maybe only once a month. Here you might find hymns in more modern idiom and sermons or talks lasting rather longer. I couldn't find a picture of St John's and St Stephen's inside, so I had to find a picture on their website of this familiar face, looking vaguely broody, I think. You could go to St John's and St Stephen's, which doesn't meet in a church at all, but in a school, where you'd probably find a slightly more relaxed feel and a particular emphasis on issues around peace and economic and social justice. Or you could climb the hill and come to the real Church of England, namely Earley St Peter's, where you would find something that had a mixture of all of the above, old and new songs, but with a robed choir at the front, probably celebrating communion and with a mixture of more and less formal elements. Now, the really surprising thing the student would find on their imaginary journey around Reading's churches would be that all of these churches claim to be part of the same thing, the Church of England. They might have very different ways of worshipping, they might look very different inside. The kinds of beliefs you might hear articulated in the sermons or talks might be very different or even downright contradictory, and yet they would all claim to be part of the Church of England. So now our poor student, encountering such a bewildering range of bishops and churches, might wonder what on earth the C of E is, as indeed might you and I. The Church of England has struggled with what it is almost from the beginning. Sometimes this is in the face of pressure from outside events. The question about whether or not to close churches during the pandemic has split the Church of England, often on fairly partisan lines. But it's not just external events. The need to try and explain what the C of E is when we talk to other churches is something which has caused us trouble. And of course, we've struggled to define what Anglicanism might be in relation to some contemporary issues like the role of women in ministry or the way the church should deal with same-sex relationships. Just as the proverbial drunk reaches for a lamppost, the Anglican confused about the C of E's identity will reach for Richard Hooker. There he is on the left outside Exeter Cathedral, holding a great book, his Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity. Now, if you were choosing whether or not to come this evening, it's certainly true that the title of Sam's talk is considerably sexier than mine. No one could describe Of the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity as a sexy title. In fact, it was so unsexy that nobody really read it for about 100 years after Hooker, its author, died. I'm going to say just a little bit about Hooker's life and then spend a few minutes thinking about what he might tell us about what the Church of England is. So there's Hooker, born in modern day Devon, of what we might call the minor gentry. He clearly had a rich uncle, and he went on a scholarship to Corpus Christi College, Oxford, on the right. Like very many promising young men in Elizabethan England who didn't have their own independent wealth, he decided to enter the church, and he was for the main part of his ministry vicar of Temple Church on the left there, part of London's legal community. Perhaps surprisingly, given his later fame, though, that was really the peak of Hooker's career, at least in terms of advancement. He was never anything other than a vicar, and he ended his days in the building on the right, Bishopsbourne in Kent. He was never a professor or a bishop. He never held any kind of office in the royal court or in the state. So it's a bit surprising that Hooker, with his fairly typical and not particularly promising career, and his definitely unpromisingly titled book, should be the figure to whom Anglicans often turn when they try to work out what Anglicanism is. Why is it then that Hooker becomes so pivotal in Anglicans' self-understanding? Well, there are two particular reasons, and both of them are bad. One of the big questions any church faces is, how does it make decisions? How do we know what's true, and how do we know what's right? How do we know what's true about Jesus, God, and the church? How do we know what decisions we should take about the way we should order our church's life or respond to changing circumstances in the world? If you know anything about Hooker, you'll probably have come across these two phrases. The first is the three-legged stool. This is the idea that there are three pillars or legs to the stool of how a church makes decision. And from top to bottom on our screen, there's scripture, there's the words of the Bible, tradition, the faith of the saints of the past in the stained glass window, and reason. There's a thinker thinking about it all. Scripture, tradition, and reason, the three-legged stool. The other is what's called the via media, the idea that Anglicanism is some sort of idyllic middle way. This idea suggests that you can draw a line or a spectrum between the Roman Catholic Church, that's St Peter's Basilica in Rome on the left, and the Reformed churches, particularly Geneva, that's Geneva on the right. Geneva was one of the great centres of the Reformation. And the Church of England, there it is, St Paul standing against the Blitz, is on the via media view, right in the middle of this presumed spectrum. But this is not what Hooker thought. He didn't believe in any kind of three-legged stool or some sort of Catholic reformed spectrum. However, these ideas became common currency, and that's why you often hear Anglicans talking about the three-legged stool or the via media as though it says something about Anglicanism and that it can be traced back to Hooker. They're wrong about Anglicanism and they're wrong about Hooker. If we want to find something distinctive about the C of E, it cannot be this. What is it then that Hooker actually really believed about his church? Well, let's start with the idea of sermons, which is a strange place to start, but I'll explain why. Here's Rowan Williams preaching in Westminster Abbey. There was a big debate in Hooker's day about what you should include in sermons. Some people, called the Puritans, thought you should really only use the words of scripture in your sermons. You shouldn't include anything else at all. If you go to Vicar College, you'll know that every now and then there's a craze about including other things in your sermon. When I was at Theological College, it was art. Everyone got terribly excited about Renaissance pictures, and almost every sermon began with you looking at a picture and trying to decode it, and it told you something about Jesus. It might be poetry, or it might be films or something like that. But the Puritans wouldn't have liked this at all. They thought you should only preach about the Bible in sermons. This isn't what Hooker thought. He thought you could use other things like poetry or philosophy, and that's really the key entree into Hooker's thinking. Hooker's opponents, the Puritans, thought that the Bible was really the only source of truth at all. Everything you needed to know for your life could be found in the Bible. Now, Hooker disagreed with this because it's a bit silly, even on its own terms. The Bible doesn't include huge amounts of things that we need to function. For instance, says Hooker, suppose you're a London lawyer trying to work on a customs code, very topical in these Brexit days. You won't find anything in the Bible that deals with the regulation of international trade. Or, for example, suppose you're a householder with some servants. What time should you get your servants to cook your meal? The Bible doesn't tell you. You've got to have some other source of truth, says Hooker. You can't just rely on the Bible for everything. In fact, says Hooker, it demeans God to think that the Bible is the only source of truth. Because go back to our image. Yes, God gave us the Bible, but how do you think you have a mind, says Hooker, in the first place? How can you think at all? It's not that God gave you a Bible and you created your own brain. God gave us the words of Scripture to teach us things, and he gave us a brain to think with as well. And that's the core of Hooker's argument. God is teaching us things by different ways, particularly through Scripture and through reason. Hooker was a lot less bothered by tradition. We don't really have time to talk about that now, but if anyone wants to come back to that in questions. So there are two sources of truth, says Hooker. There's God's revelation, particularly in Scripture, and our own ability to think on the basis of what we can see and infer by our own reason. Two sources of knowledge from God: reason and revelation, Scripture and the human mind. And the key to human knowledge, to theology, says Hooker, is knowing what kind of knowledge each of these routes delivers you. So, says Hooker, by reason, you can find out really quite a lot. You could, for example, look at the world around you and think it must have been created by something, because the chance of such a world emerging at random must be quite minimal. You could perhaps think that human beings had some sort of restlessness or desire in them for something which can't be satisfied by the means at hand in the world. You could understand that wealth or status or sex or power in the end doesn't make you happy. So you can, says Hooker, learn quite a lot by your reason. But who could imagine that God was not just some great distant being in the sky, but Father, Son, and Spirit, an eternal, constant relationship of love? Who could conceive for a moment that a human body might be raised from the dead and brought back to new life? Who could think for a second that God would love the world so much that he would come and live as a human being himself? None of those things, says Hooker, are accessible to human reason. They must come from another source. It must be the revelation that God shows us in the life of Jesus Christ and in the words of the Scripture. And once you've understood this distinction, you've understood Hooker and the kind of Church of England that he believed should exist. For Hooker, the fundamentals of faith, the things that we all have to agree on if we're to be Christian, are the things that the Church took out of Scripture directly. And in particular, the way that Scripture was interpreted by the first four councils in the first 5 centuries of Christian history. The things that we recite if we're Anglicans in the creeds week by week. So the Bible, as articulated in the creeds, are the things that all Christians must believe about God being the Trinity, about Jesus coming to earth, about his death, resurrection for our salvation. Those are the things that all Christians need to believe if they're to be genuinely Christian, and Hooker would say to be genuinely Anglican. And that's the core of Anglicanism for Hooker, the space that's created by the Bible as interpreted by the first 4 councils. But note that this is quite a negative view of theology and of Anglicanism. It's almost as though Hooker is saying, if you want to be a Christian and you want to be an Anglican, you can't have a sherry and you can't have a cup of tea, but you can have anything else in the drinks cabinet. And more importantly, you can choose what drink you have, what glass it comes in, how quickly or slowly you drink it, and all that kind of thing, whether you have ice in it or not, whether you put milk and sugar in or not. I hope you can see what I'm getting at. Anglicanism for Hooker is about holding open a space on common ground, but with lots of variety and variation within it. There's quite a lot that you can believe and still be drinking from the drinks cabinet of Anglicanism. What Hooker is doing is ruling things out rather than in. We're coming in to land now, and you've been very patient. What does this idea of Hooker's drinks cabinet mean for Anglicanism? Well, it means that all of the kinds of expression we saw in those churches, St Giles, St Barnabas, St John's and Stephen's, Greyfriars and St Peter's, are genuinely Anglican, albeit with their difference in form and shape, style and colour. but it does rule some things out. It's very difficult on Hooker's model to think of the church changing dramatically the way it understands Jesus. That's not to say that there isn't more to discover about Jesus and more ways of expressing things, but Hooker is not really a liberal theologian in the sense of thinking that the core tenets of Christian faith are up for grabs. Hooker would not, for instance, think very much of someone who said, I'm an Anglican, and didn't believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus from the dead. Now, you might think that's a good limit or a bad one, but it's a limit to Hooker's view of Anglicanism. Again, it's very hard to see Hooker agreeing that you could change some of the fundamental kind of natural moral laws that Hooker thought were observable to all human beings by their reason. So the idea, as one recent collection of essays suggested, that Hooker would be in favour of same-sex marriage really isn't going to get off the ground. You can believe in same-sex marriage or not, but the idea Hooker would is not really a very sensible one. It's also true that Hooker never really gives us a clear idea of what are those essential things that all Anglicans must believe and what are things that can vary. So, for instance, Hooker believes and says explicitly that some things can come and go. We could get rid of bishops, for instance, and we'd still be Anglican, though bishops don't generally like being told that. You could change the form of the wedding service, so you could dispense with having a ring, for instance. But those are fairly limited changes that Hooker thinks are acceptable, and he does set a boundary there. So let me come into land with this thought. People look back and say that Hooker is a St Giles Hooker or a Greyfriars Hooker or an Earley St Peter's Hooker, that he represents one particular mode of Anglicanism, and they then try and make him in their own image by emphasising things that he thought. The problem is that Hooker and Anglicanism is much more elusive than that. What really grounds it is a belief in the essentials of Christian faith, which must be shared, and then a pretty fair amount of freedom and flexibility in how you shape your church life beyond that. I think that's a pretty open and generous idea of a church. I think it does distinguish the Anglican brand of Christianity from others that want to hone in more precisely on one particular expression, in whether it's in worship or in the structure of the church. I think there's a lot to be said for it, and it's one of the reasons I'm an Anglican rather than something else. But of course, it's frustrating and vexing because it means you have to put up with people who might think quite differently from you on some things you think are quite important. And it means that we can't cling on to vague cliches like the three-legged stool or the via media in support of what makes Anglicanism distinctive. But I think what makes Hooker and Anglican distinctive is that insistence on scripturally derived essentials and then generous flexibility in everything else. And I think that's a pretty good place to start if you want to think about what Anglicanism might be. You've been very patient. I look forward to chatting about it more, and thanks for listening.
Philip, that was absolutely superb. I knew virtually nothing about Richard Hooker, so that was a wonderful little snapshot. Friends, what we're going to do now is pause and have a conversation. We don't normally have quite as much openness in Café Theo. It's normally a bit more formal, but I'd really like to encourage us to actually have a kind of open conversation of back and forth for about 15 minutes or so. So if you'd like to do something to ask a question, put your camera on, raise a hand so I can see you, or use the electronic hand raising. And if you don't want to speak aloud, write in the chat facility and Susie will read your question for us. And great, we're straight off with David Langshaw.
Two things, if I may. Firstly, I'm from St John St Stephen's Church. Just to sort of bang on the head this old canard, we don't worship in a school. It's just that the school and the church are linked together. Think of us like a functioning version of Christ Church in Oxford. Now, I really like your idea of...
Happy to be corrected, thank you.
I really like your idea of the drinks cabinet. Is there not the danger there that as a consequence, everybody just takes what they want rather than what they need?
Thank you, David. I think that's a good question. And of course, there is always that danger. I suppose Hooker might say that the only thing we really did need was the words of Scripture and the bread and wine of the sacrament, and that so long as one was feeding on those, what other drinks you took from the cabinet didn't much matter. So I think so long as we're reading the same Bible and sharing the same communion, that would do for him.
you, Ralph Holbrook. Ralph.
Philip, thank you so much. In that talk, it was as though you were describing what we refer to in the church, in the creed, as the Catholic Church.
Mm.
Your definition is Catholic in that it's both inclusive and orthodox. This is what you said, this is what makes a Christian. So when an Elizabethan, say, or Hooker himself might be thinking about the Catholic Church, all those who truly believed and worshipped in accordance with the scriptures would count as Catholic. But you haven't actually addressed the question of polity and certain things that Hooker had to think about, like the relationship with the Crown, which had, by its actions, created the Church of England. I'm sorry, I hope that doesn't sound too critical. You haven't, obviously, in such a short compass, got time to address all these issues. I mean, I could mention other things, but...
Sure.
Yeah.
No, thank you, Ralph. And I think there are particular limitations to the way Hooker sees things in terms of polity. He can't really imagine there being more than one church in the same country, for instance. He can't really imagine a sort of supranational or international organization, which is because for Hooker, the church and the state are the same, or the church and the nation are the same. It's exactly the same community in different guises. And for Hooker, just as the monarch has the right through Parliament to make laws for the country, so the monarch through Parliament has the power to make laws for the church. That is, that's the historical reality he faced with Elizabethan England. It's a bit harder to see how that works in a society of many denominations or indeed many faiths, or where, for instance, you had a head of state who was explicitly not a Christian. So yes, I think there are limitations. But on the subject of Catholic, I think he would say that that the Roman Catholics were Catholic and that the Reformed were Catholic if they believed in that core of Christian faith. Whatever particular polity or decisions they made about worship was for him not unimportant, but not essential. Thank you.
Thanks, Philip. Thank you, Ralph. Gianni.
So does Hooker talk at all about like the 39 articles or other things like that in terms of like having to be an Anglican? Like, would you say you have to accept the 39 articles or like parts of them, or could they be dispensed with like bishops? Like, where would they fall?
Of course, the 13 articles didn't exist at that point in exactly the form we have them now, because they don't take their final form until the 1662 prayer book, though there were articles of religion. I think he would say that it was legitimate to ask clergy to agree to them, yes. But there's nothing in them. I mean, the articles are very carefully worded if you read them. So, the classic one is they say the Bible contains all things necessary to salvation. That's to say all the doctrines you need to believe in order to be a Christian and saved. They don't say anything about who is saved or anything like that, which then becomes a subject of dispute. So the articles are a fairly broad thing to agree to. I mean, they're not elastic. You couldn't get away with saying someone is saved by virtue of being a good Muslim, for instance. So they're not sort of being pluralist in that sense. But they're quite a generous document in many ways. And yes, he would say that where the articles required you to believe things, all they require you to believe is the creeds, and the faith of the Bible is expressed in the creeds.
I might be misremembering. Doesn't it say also? So, like, what would he say about justification by faith alone, or something like that?
Oh, he'd believe it. Yeah.
Would you have to believe it to be an Anglican, or is it kind of like a?
Yes. Yes, I think you would. But yes, Jenny. I mean, that's condensing quite a huge, as you know, debate. Say, for instance, what Hooker would agree, as all the Reformed did, that you were saved only by the action of Christ and what he wins for us on the cross. That wouldn't have been a particularly controversial statement. I'd probably need to know a bit more about where you're coming from to give you a better answer, but perhaps that's part of an answer.
I can see in the chat, Susie, would you pick up David's comment?
Yes, so question from David Harris, thank you very much. When and why did the myth of the three-legged stool and the via media emerge?
Thank you. Difficult to say. I mean, the via media goes back to Newman, who sort of popularized the phrase, though he meant something a little bit different by it. So they're sort of late 19th century creations, as particularly those in the Oxford movement who were trying to reintroduce elements of Catholic worship into the Church of England that had been lost at the Reformation, were trying to find a way of, which Newman in the end couldn't reconcile himself, of being Anglican in a more Catholic way. And so they talked particularly about the via media as a way of saying we're not being un-Anglican, we're sort of steering this path between excesses, both Catholic and Reformed. And the three-legged stool emerged about the same time. They become, again, really popular in the sort of early to mid 20th century. And it emerged, I think, partly because it was very difficult to say, it was becoming increasingly difficult in the 20th century to say what Anglicanism was, as opposed to Catholicism or Calvinism or Methodism, because there were lots of different kinds of Anglican. You've got people like Lord Halifax going off and trying to, in the Malines conversations in the 1920s, trying to reunite with Rome, basically. And then you've got sort of hotter Protestant kind of Anglicans marching with the Orange Order. So it's partly because of that people start to cling for things that make Anglicanism as opposed to something else.
Very good, thank you.
Ross, and very warm welcome, Ross. Hi.
Hello, thank you. I'm putting myself into the position of your fictional student who's just turned up in Reading. And I'm remembering when I was a student in York, brought up Church of England and Anglican, but actually arriving in York and not really knowing that I was Anglican and church shopping across denominations, still not realizing that that's what I was doing. How important is it to teach congregations and, I suppose, our youth about what it is to be Anglican, and what is it that we teach them as they prepare to make their own choices about church and worship?
Thanks, Ross. That's a great question. How important is it to teach people that they're Anglicans or that they could be? I mean, in a sense, not very important at all, because what matters is that we're Christians, and the form it takes is, less important. So in one sense, not important at all. In another, I think it is important because it means that within one family, there are all sorts of different ways of praying and ways of worshipping that I might learn from. And somehow it's easier, I think, to learn from within the same family than if you feel a foreigner. So if I can give an example of that, quite a personal one, when I was at theological college, I was quite ill and had to have a fairly major operation, and I didn't really know what to do. So I sort of tried a bit of everything. So I went to an evangelical church where people prayed for me in tongues. And I went at 7:30 in the morning to a very Anglo-Catholic church with 3 old ladies and a cat to be anointed. And that was very powerful for me because I felt at home in both places. I didn't feel I was going somewhere else, if that makes sense. So I think the reason it's worth teaching it is because I think there is something special about Anglicanism in trying to hold together Greyfriars and St Giles in the same family, and that we can gain so much from other members of the family. So it's because of how it could help all of our own spiritual journeys to learn from other ways of following Jesus, within the same family that I think it is worth speaking about. And I might talk about things like that, the way I can learn a lot from others.
Thank you.
And thank you for that, Ross. I mean, as I look around the world, we've had the failed impeachment of Trump for a second time, and the culture wars in America, and then just sort of every time I switch on Twitter or Facebook, it's a very divided world. And I wonder whether the gift of Anglicanism might be something to do with allowing diversity. That idea that Anglicanism is about making a space. That seems like it's a wonderfully prophetic thing to offer in a world. But maybe other churches don't do. But at the same time, I watch our church kind of tear itself apart.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I think you summarised both the beauty and the dilemma of Anglicanism well. I mean, to go back to something Ralph said, of course, the reason, or part of the reason Hooker is so generous, is because in his day people were dying because of their particular flavour of Christianity, and some of the genius of the Anglicanism that Elizabeth, and I mean, really the person we haven't talked about is Queen Elizabeth, who I think is a fascinating and powerful woman who we don't really give enough credit to. She created this space in which you could be a loyal, faithful citizen and Christian in a wide range of ways, without the extremes killing each other. And that, given what happened, to England in the mid 17th century, was at least a stunning achievement in its intent. So yes, as an example of how you can be part of the same family and have quite strong disagreements without killing each other, I think there's something said for it. But it's not perfect. I think it's also worth saying we mustn't be misty-eyed. You could go to Methodist churches where they're having a charismatic experience, or ones where they're wearing ornate robes. It's not that other communions or traditions don't do this, but I think there is something about it being embedded in the Anglican way of doing things that it perhaps isn't quite in the others.
Thank you.
There's a comment in the chat from Lisa, and she says about importance, I do think that being distinctly indistinct, which may be distinctly inclusive, is important to the shopping teenager or student.
Thank you, Lisa. And I think I agree with what I think you're saying. Except that I think inclusive is quite a positive statement, not a negative one. So it can come across as inclusive means anything goes, and I don't think that's quite what Anglicanism means for Hooker. And I don't think it means you can't be clear that you're an Anglican in a particular way, but that there's room for all of that in the same family. So it's inclusive in that sense of having a range of, in the same way that, my family is inclusive, but we're very strident in our opinions and we express them to each other sometimes with some force.
Yes, I was meaning the latter for sure, yeah. Philip, thank you.
Yeah. No, thank you.
April, did you want to ask something?
Yeah, I was going to pick up.
Sorry, not to give your church a shout out, April. April's
I know. Come on.
A very fine church.
A very fine church. Yes,
and Ross. Sorry, I didn't put something.
No, I was just reflecting on what you and Ross were, talking about where you might put, and I understand from what you were saying that Richard Hooker was talking about a very different society, but where you would put the potentially interesting question of the parish system in terms of the distinctly Anglican sense of everyone. And I know you touched on it earlier with the sort of the where Richard Hooker saw it, but in terms of the Anglican parish being there for everyone. Anyway, I'll stop talking and
No, thank you. And I think the answer is pretty clear. Hooker would not die in a ditch over the parish system any more than he would over there being bishops or clergy wearing particular vestments or something like that. It's an incidental form, not an unimportant one, but that he wouldn't say the parish system is what constitutes Anglicanism, or that it would cease to be Anglicanism without it. But I think if I can just connect this to Charlotte's comment, what he would want to hold on to is that the church is not just for those who profess it, it's there for the whole community. And so insofar as the parish system in some sense is an attempt to embody that care for the whole community, he would think it, he would want to ask some very serious questions before abandoning it, not least because it might lead oddly to a narrowly parochial view. Thanks, April, and thanks, Charlotte. I hope I've
got time for one last question from Philip. Philip, given that I'm not seeing anybody else, I should chuck one in. So this came out of your PhD, I understand. Were you changed as a result of reading about Hooker, studying Hooker? What effect did it have on you?
I mean, sleepless nights and grey hairs, as anyone who's tried to any part-time study will. I think it's made me, I think two things. I think first, it's made me a lot more impatient with the rather naff ways we talk about Anglicanism, even at very senior levels. We can be very misty-eyed about it and very sort of gooey about it. And Hooker's Anglicanism is not misty-eyed or gooey. You know, he recognizes it is hard. Inclusivity is hard. It's hard to be in a church where not everybody worships the same way I do. That's hard work. So I think it's made me aware of the sharp edge to Hooker and to Anglicanism because of that insistence. I also think it's made me more aware of the ways in which we really differ from both elements within Anglicanism and with other communions. You know, I think an obvious one is it's very difficult to see on this view of Anglicanism space for a pope, because Hooker insists that all forms of structure are in principle equally valid, and you can't make claims that one is the right way, which is what at an official level Catholicism says about the Pope. Equally, he's fairly clear that you can't make people sign up to more than those basics, and so churches that do require people to assent to something else than the creeds are stepping quite far beyond what Hooker would have agreed to. And that kind of issue raises itself, as Mark and others in universities will know, about making people sign doctrinal bases before inviting them to speak, for instance. I think that is something Hooker would have looked kindly on. So it's sharpened my thinking and made me think more sharply about some of the ways Anglicans talk about themselves.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. Thank you so much, Philip. If we can all just pause, if you'd like to kind of put your screen on a moment, just show a round of applause, that'd be wonderful. And Philip, whilst we do that, if you've got a recommendation of anybody who wants to read something more about Hooker or listen to a podcast, maybe you could pop that in the chat so people would follow that up. But thank you.
Thank you.